A few years ago, the UU Ministers Association announced that they'd worked with the Standing on the Side of Love campaign and a clergy outfitters and church supply company to produce shirts with clerical collars in Standing on the Side of Love yellow and with the Standing on the Side of Love heart logo on one sleeve. This was actually in advance of the 2012 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association that was to take place in Phoenix, a GA that had been specifically recast as a Justice GA. Standing on the Side of Love had already played a prominent role at the various protests against Arizona's draconian anti-immigrant law, SB 1070, making it really obvious when Unitarian Universalists showed up in large numbers, thanks to their yellow Standing on the Side of Love t-shirts. Ministers of all denominations were part of such protests, wearing their shirts with clerical collars to make it obvious to the media, the police, and everyone else who might be watching that they were there as religious witnesses. And many UU ministers wore both Standing on the Side of Love t-shirts and their clergy shirts, one over the other. But since GA takes place at the end of June, someone realized that that would just be too many layers of clothing to wear in Phoenix in the summer, hence the Standing on the Side of Love clergy shirt, short-sleeved too. Now, I was already considering buying a shirt with a clerical collar to wear at public witness events at GA and elsewhere, whether protesting racial profiling, worker exploitation, economic injustice, or marriage inequality. So I thought that this was a great idea. I soon realized, though, that not all of my colleagues felt the same way. Some disliked the shirts on aesthetic grounds. Yellow just isn't everybody's color. Others objected to what they saw as the corruption of a religious message through merchandising. Some complained about the Unitarian Universalist sense of terminal uniqueness, the belief that we're not only separate from, but so much better than other religions. Others argued that we are separate and thus have no right to a traditional symbol of Christian ministry. Of course, that traditional should be in quotes. The Church of England records that the clerical collar was invented by a Scottish Presbyterian minister in the 1890s and was only adopted by Catholic priests in the 1960s. On the other hand, I remembered the story that in 1917, the clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church assembled in St. Petersburg. Nothing too remarkable about priests and ministers getting together, except that the Russian Revolution was going on at the same time. And so, the story goes, while the clergy were engaged in a bitter debate over the colour of priestly vestments, the revolution was raging just a few blocks away. So I bought one of these shirts with the full intention of wearing it at protests and other places where I'm being a minister who works for justice, because it's the revolution that really matters, not the debate about what clothes you wear to go to the revolution. Now, we also buy our Christmas Eve candles, the same ones we use for Joys and Sorrows, from the same company. So we're on their mailing list and we get their catalogues. They sell all sorts of church supplies, including big altar candles that actually burn a liquid fuel rather than being made of wax. There are apparently advantages to this, as shown in a recent catalogue that we received from them. Here's a picture. Not to be mean, but I couldn't help laughing when I saw these pictures. I mean, the picture on the right, he's so happy to have these liquid candles with his made-up chart on the computer screen that's showing apparently that the church is saving an apparently exponentially growing amount of money, but he's throwing away all their wax candles even if they've never actually been used. I don't know if you can see, but most of the candles in that basket have never been burnt. And then there's the picture on the left. She looks so happy to have her nice, clean, liquid-burning candle compared to that old, dribbly wax candle. I mean, just look at how miserable she was with the old candle, dripping wax everywhere. But here's the thing. Yes, aesthetics are important, and if you're going to have something in somebody's field of view for a while, like at the front of a church, then you want it to look nice and not distract people from whatever it is that they should actually be doing. But this picture about candles represents something much bigger, something much more important, something that has turned so many people off when it comes to so-called organized religion. Is the dribbly wax candle really a problem compared to the fact that there are people living on the streets not too far from that church? Is it a worthwhile investment of emotional energy when neighborhood children are living in poverty and failing in school? Is it so essential that the worship space be spotlessly perfect when parts of town have such polluted air that the life expectancy of residents is reduced? There are much more pressing, much more important issues than dribbly wax candles. So let me introduce you to somebody that I met recently. This is Ger Milandu Mwanga. He lives in Cape Town, South Africa, and he's a member of the Unitarian Church of Cape Town. And I met him in Chicago in January when he was there as one of the international students with the Meadville Lombard Theological School. Here's a picture that the school posted showing Mwanga, another international student, Blaise Natakarutimana, next to him, and our own student minister, Chris Hockman. Now, I sat next to Mwanga at lunch one day, and he told me his story. He's actually from Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo, where he was a journalist by profession and an active volunteer with the Evangelical Church of Congo. For all that he enjoyed his work at the church, he increasingly found himself at odds with some of its teachings and practices, to the point where he declined pastoral training when the church offered it to him. What's more, civil war broke out in the late 90s. And between the damage done to Brazzaville itself and the ongoing political instability, he decided to leave the country, eventually settling in Cape Town. He discovered the Unitarian Church there after being invited as a guest to a wedding officiated by their minister. He found the message of the church to be in line with his own thinking, so he joined and he got involved. He was actually married there himself, and his son was dedicated in the church too. He served on the church council, and given his own background in journalism, he edits the church newsletter too. But what got him really excited when he was telling me his story was his work in a couple of church programs. One of the programs, Outreach Action, promotes Unitarian values in the public arena, but by supporting social justice activities, community development, and charitable aid. As an outgrowth of that, Mwanga himself launched a program called the Compassion Project, which collects surplus food and clothing and distributes them to about 20 poverty-stricken neighborhoods around the city. What's more, having found a church in line with his own values, Mwanga decided that the time and place were right to accept the training that he previously declined. Thanks to online materials provided by the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches, which is based in England, Mwanga began to more formally study his newfound faith, and in the process became an international student at Meadville too. But he doesn't just see himself becoming a UU minister. As he shared with me, he sees this faith, the faith we share, as very much needed by his fellow Africans in Congo and elsewhere, and indeed much more appropriate for African people generally than the Christianity that was imposed upon them by European colonialists. What a breathtaking vision. Mwanga sees Unitarian Universalism making a difference in people's lives, not just in one church, not just in one city, not just in one country, but all across an entire continent. While that would be many lifetimes' work for just one person, I suspect that Mwanga will find many others willing to help him. And you never know, in fact, how people will step up to help until you actually ask them. Architecture for Humanity, for instance, was a US-based non-profit that for about 15 years sought to design solutions to humanitarian crises and brought professional architectural services to communities in need. Using an open source model inspired by non-profit computer programmers, Architecture for Humanity hosted a series of design contests to find innovative solutions for systemic issues of poverty. In one of the first such contests, they asked people to come up with the best design possible for a mobile AIDS clinic for a town in Africa. They posted the deadline and they waited. Since they'd never done anything like this before, they didn't know if anyone would submit anything. But then on the day of the deadline for submissions, a FedEx delivery man rang the doorbell. They saw that he was carrying a large bag stuffed with envelopes, and they asked, "Are all those for us?" "No," said the delivery man, and then he turned to point to the 3 big FedEx trucks lined up on the street behind him. "All those are yours too." The moral of the story? More people than you can imagine are just waiting to be asked to help make the world a better place. Then there's the story of the largest LGBTQ-friendly congregation in the world. It didn't start out that way, of course. The Metropolitan Community Church of Dallas was founded in 1970 with just a dozen members. It met in people's homes until it could get its own place to hold services and grew steadily through the 70s and even into the 80s. But then that started to change when the AIDS crisis developed. As an MCC congregation, many of the members were gay men, and so they were particularly impacted by the epidemic. And when the church called Michael Piazza as its minister, it was no longer a growing church. Rather, it was a dying church, literally dying. Its members dying. Piazza wondered how long it would be until he had to lock up for the last time after finishing the memorial service of the very last member. It would have been easy to give up. But they didn't give up. They moved from this gloomy, practically windowless building that had been their church into a storefront that had more pink on it than a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. And then they renamed themselves the Cathedral of Hope, which seemed absurdly bold at the time. It doesn't exactly look like a cathedral. But hope was really all that they had. So they persevered, and they took care of one another, and they reached out to sympathizers, and they turned themselves around, until they outgrew that pink storefront and had to build themselves a church that actually looked like something deserving to be called a cathedral. And by the time Piazza was called to serve another congregation a decade later, they had more than 3,000 members. That's their sanctuary. And they were giving away more than $1 million in direct assistance and volunteer community support every year. They had become, in fact, the largest inclusive, liberal, LGBTQ-friendly congregation in the world. And remember where I said they are? Dallas, Texas. It was about a year ago when I heard this story, and when Piazza had shared it with us being a room full of UU ministers from around the country, he asked a very good question. What was holding us back? He asked. All of our UU congregations, he observed, are much better off than the Metropolitan Community Church of Dallas was at the height of the AIDS crisis. Most of us are also in places considerably more friendly to liberal theology than Dallas. We really have no reason not to be able to make as big a difference, to reach as many people yearning to hear our saving message. Now, a few months ago, the ministers, directors of religious education, and other religious professionals of the Tidewater Cluster were meeting at the UU Community Church of Glen Allen. This is, in fact, a gathering I attend each month, half the time bringing together all of us in Virginia outside the DC metro area, the rest of the time just those of us serving within the Tidewater Cluster. which is made up of UU congregations in Fredericksburg, Richmond, Glenallen, Williamsburg, Norfolk, Whitestone, and of course Newport News. And since on that occasion it was those of us in the Tidewater cluster who were there, we were talking about what we want the Tidewater cluster to be, what we need it to be. And we really do need it to be. I don't know how much you know about the congregations in those other towns I mentioned, but Richmond is the only one that could be considered large, with multiple ministers and a sizable staff. The rest of the congregations, including our own, are quite a bit smaller. The UU Fellowship of the Rappahannock in Whitestone doesn't even have a minister or a DRE or other staff. And it's a challenge to be a small congregation, particularly a small congregation that wants to make a difference, that wants to reach as many people yearning to hear our saving message. So we started talking about vision, our vision of the Tidewater cluster, our vision of how our congregations not only might, but really do need to work together to support one another, our vision of what we want to be as congregations. And we were talking about how our vision needs to be bigger, bolder, more daring, more inspiring. And we were talking about how we need to be better about getting that point across to everybody. And Chris Johns, who is DRE of the UU Fellowship of Fredericksburg, was trying to put into words how she was feeling about this, and finally said out loud, with just a little bit of exasperation, we need to be a bigger thing. Be a bigger thing. What a great way of putting it, actually. It's not just about numbers. Numbers as in 3,000 people in a sanctuary. People talk about congregational growth as if growth is an end unto itself. It's not. It's not an end. It's a consequence. Congregations grow when they are doing church well, and when impediments to growth, which are usually impediments to doing church well too, have been removed. And it's doing church well that really matters. A congregation of 100 people that's doing church well can be much more effective than a congregation of 1,000 that seems to be really busy, but isn't actually doing anything more than keeping itself busy. As Thoreau put it, it is not enough to be busy. So are the ants. The question is, what are you busy about? Moreover, if a congregation is not just busy but genuinely doing church well, then it will grow because people will want to be a part of it. But the most important piece of it is vision. A big, bold, daring, pie-in-the-sky vision. All details still matter, of course. I'm a details person, so I know that details make a difference. Take the humble comma, for instance. Did you know that the humble comma saves lives? Here's an innocuous sentence. Let's eat, comma, Grandma. It's an invitation to a family meal. But what happens if the comma is missing? Let's eat, Grandma. Now it's an invitation to a very different sort of meal. Details matter, but only in service to the bigger message, the bigger vision. Did the Metropolitan Community Church of Dallas have all the details figured out? Did they have any of the details figured out when they renamed themselves the Cathedral of Hope? Does Gur Malandu Mwanga have all the details figured out when it comes to bringing Unitarian Universalism to the Congo and beyond, all across Africa? He will, at some point, have to figure out all the details, but the big, bold, amazing vision has to come first. So what's our vision of ourselves as a congregation, of Unitarian Universalism as a movement? What is our big, bold, daring vision? This is a question our world desperately needs us to answer, and it's an answer that we need to be able to provide. Here's one piece of an answer that attracted a lot of attention recently from UU Minister Nancy Bowen, the UUA's lead in the Pacific Western region. The purpose of the church, she said, is to heal the consequences of lovelessness and injustice in the hearts and souls of our members so that they might heal the community and together heal the world. That's a big, bold, planet-spanning vision. And don't we believe that we're capable of that? Don't we believe that Unitarian Universalism has that to offer our world? Don't we believe that our own Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Peninsula can do our part of this right here? Such a vision has to be something we can believe in, something that calls us to be a bigger thing. And that's not to say that it won't have its critics, who will try to smother the dream in its cradle before it can ever grow up. So let me finish by saying something about that. Here's a piece of wisdom I've seen on bumper stickers credited in this or other versions as a Chinese proverb or a quote from writers including George Bernard Shaw and James Baldwin. Those who say it can't be done should get out of the way of those who are doing it. I don't know if this was ever said by the professor for whom I worked for a couple of years in San Diego, but it could certainly have been his motto. As well as running the biophysics lab where I worked, Kent Wilson had a group of undergraduates working for him in a computer lab, focusing in particular, at the time when I was there, on virtual reality and similar interfaces. And when asked why he always hired undergraduates, instead of more experienced researchers or even graduate students, Kent would explain that as undergraduates, they didn't yet know what couldn't be done. In other words, they could come up with great ideas and then actually have the freedom to try them out to see if they worked, rather than be limited in their imagination by all those built-in, self-defeating mechanisms that most of us inevitably develop as we get older. No, that will never work, we tell ourselves. No, that's not practical, we say, shutting ourselves down. No, it's never been done that way before. Experience is great when it comes to quickly solving a familiar problem, but it's actually a hindrance to coming up with better solutions. In the words of Clara Barton, Universalist and founder of the American Red Cross, "It irritates me to be told how things have always been done. I defy the tyranny of precedent. I cannot afford the luxury of a closed mind." So let's dream big and imagine even bigger. Let's take all the wonderful things we already do and dare to be a bigger thing. This faith, this community is far too important, far too rare to think small. We are, in the words of UU Minister Carolyn Owen Toll, both fragile and rooted. Vulnerable, yet still we venture our lives courageously toward hope and light. Like a flower, we too exude our own illumination, colour, pulse, and scent. Only we call them friendship, love, justice, and hope. So let's defy the tyranny of precedent and claim that big, bold, daring vision for ourselves. May it be so.